Third area, third challenge that Zionism met, albeit unconsciously, and for large parts of Zionism unwillingly, very reluctantly, is the challenge of restoring at least the possibility that there may actually be a God, and that Judaism's idea of God may actually have been right all along, and that the Holocaust did not fatally discredit Jewish faith in the divine, in its concept of a God of history. And certainly the creation of Israel in 1948 did very little to restore the faith of Jews in God. If anything, the establishment of the state in 1948 seemed to confirm the secular Zionist argument that the only way in which we will ever be redeemed is if we stop believing in the miraculous and start to take the initiative in our own hands. So 1948 was a confirmation of secular Zionism's rejection of the divine I would say, for most Jews. The fact that we're talking about 3 years after the Shoah meant that even if there was any stirrings of any sense of a religious awakening in some Jews at seeing the great Jewish myth, the great religious myth, being fulfilled, albeit through secular means, I think that those religious stirrings were, for the most part, suppressed by the ongoing shock of the Shoah. And Jews in 1948 were, for the most part, in no state spiritually to translate the emergence, the rebirth of Israel in religious terms. That, of course, happened in 1967. And it happened in 1967, I would say, for two reasons. The first reason was that we relived in those weeks before the Six-Day War, the period known as Tqufat HaHamtana, the 3 weeks between May 15th, when Nasser shut the Straits of Tiran and ordered the UN peacekeeping troops out, and June 5th, when the war began. In those 3 weeks, we psychologically, we meaning the entire Jewish people, psychologically relived the 1930s and felt that the 1930s are coming. We're in the 1930s, and the 1940s are imminent. The fact that the 1940s got reversed in the greatest Jewish military victory in history was a shock on the level of, I think that Purim is the religious model that works best. Here you had a community that thought they were going toward the gallows, and in the end, rather than they being hung on the gallows, their enemies are hung on the gallows. So not only is there reprieve, but there is reversal. That was the impact of the Six-Day War, coupled with the return to the religious symbols of the Jewish people, which, don't forget, the state of Israel from 1948 to 1967 had almost no religious symbols. What we had in Jerusalem was a fake grave of King David. I think that was our only religious symbol. And we had several anti-religious symbols like the seat of the chief rabbin in Beit Shlomo. But for the most part, there were no, as far as I can see, we did not have authentic religious symbols in the state of Israel. We had Meron, we had the second tier. We had religious symbols that were basically symbols from the period of exile. If anyone can correct me, maybe I'm missing. Maybe I'm forgetting.
About sites, not just
Sorry?
Religious sites.
Religious sites is what I mean. Religious sites.
There's a grave of Yehuda B'Sir. Not
Third tier.
it's the son of the Mishnah. So.
Yeah, that's treasure.
Yeah. So what we did not have were national religious symbols, and now suddenly in '67 we return to these religious symbols, which we had from 1948 to 1967. The Jewish people had basically suppressed its longings for the Kotel and Kever Rachel. We allowed ourselves to forget that the reborn state of Israel did not contain the most powerful religious symbols in the land of Israel. Partly because we were so grateful for anything that we did have, that it would have seemed almost like nitpicking. Yeah, well, you gave us a state, but what about what about that place? Most Jews did not go there, psychologically or emotionally. Suddenly, in 1967, we realized how much the Kotel and these other sites meant to us, and the symbol for that became the paratroopers on June 7, 1967, reaching the wall, and some of them, including diehard secularists, kibbutznikim, weeping at the wall. There is a disagreement to this day. Who wept? How many? I'm working on a book now about the paratroopers who fought in Jerusalem. I don't think I've met one secularist who has admitted that he actually wept. And I met one or two religious paratroopers who say, well, maybe we had tears in our eyes. Not a great outpouring of weeping that I've been able to find. Nevertheless, the sensibility, the myth at the time was that the paratroopers reached the wall and wept. It created a tremendous, powerful expression of what the Jewish people as a whole was feeling at the time. So that the God of Israel suddenly made a reappearance in the Jewish people. And it's no coincidence that the Chazara B'Tshuvah movement begins in earnest in the diaspora with 1967. The diaspora yeshiva, which is really the grandfather of the Tshuva movement, opens, I think, that year, or maybe even that summer. And the Tshuva movement then extends into Israel among Israelis after the Yom Kippur War, but that already becomes has a momentum of its own. So Israel, in the first generation, the generation of the founding of the state, and those of us who grew up with Israel in the 60s and 70s, Israel becomes the counterattack, the very successful, on all three of these levels, physical, psychological, and spiritual. Israel becomes the counterattack against the Shoah. I would argue that most Jews on one level or another, whether or not they were able to articulate this to themselves, instinctively understood that this is what Israel represented. And that, I believe, is why Israel succeeded in Zionizing the Jewish people.